The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wooden clock on the wall. Dinner plates were half empty, the faint aroma of curry still hanging in the air. Around the dining table sat the family, father at the head, his expression stern as always, sister seated neatly beside him, her shoulders straight, her chin raised high with pride. The rest of the relatives lingered around, some sipping tea, others pretending to be busy with their phones, yet all of them listening carefully. And then, the words fell like a hammer. Father's voice cold and sharp. Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you. She doesn't need help from anyone. The air seemed to freeze. The words echoed louder than they were spoken, bouncing against the walls of the small living room. Every eye in the room shifted. Some looked at the father, nodding slowly. Others glanced toward the sister with admiration. But most eyes turned to him, the son sitting quietly in the corner of the table. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, his face gave nothing away. No argument, no protest, no defense. Just silence. The sister smirked faintly, brushing her hair back with unnecessary elegance. She basked in the glow of the compliment, leaning slightly toward their father as if soaking in his words. Her eyes darted toward her brother, a look of superiority flickering across her face. Around the table, a cousin whispered under his breath, "Well, he's right, isn't he? She's the one doing everything these days." Another relative chuckled softly, hiding it behind a fake cough. The father wasn't done. His eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the table. "Father, you've always been careless. Always a burden. Look at your sister, how hardworking, independent. She doesn't ask for anything. She earns, she provides. But you? You've done nothing worth mentioning." The words cut deeper than any knife could. Yet the son did not flinch. He kept his eyes lowered, staring at the plate before him. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. Each word was a wound, each comparison a scar layered over old ones. He could feel his chest tighten, not because he didn't know the truth, but because he knew too much. He looked up slowly, his gaze meeting his father's for the briefest of seconds. His father expected a fight, maybe excuses, maybe tears. But none came. Instead, there was only calm silence. A faint, unreadable smile touched his lips, the kind that left people wondering whether it hid weakness. Or something else. The silence unsettled the room. The smirks faded, the whispers died. Even the sister shifted uneasily in her chair, as though his lack of reaction robbed her victory of its sweetness. The narrator's voice slipped in, low and steady. Imagine hearing this from your own father. Imagine being told you are worthless, while the truth you carry could shatter the very people mocking you. What would you do in that moment? Stay silent? Fight back? Or wait for the right time? The tension thickened, pressing down on everyone in the room. But he didn't move. He didn't explain. He simply sat there, still as stone, his faint smile the only answer to the insult that cut so deep. And at that moment, the story truly began. The dining room was modest, yet on nights like this it felt more like a stage than a place to eat. The yellow light of the chandelier above cast a heavy glow across the polished wooden table, making every emotion, every smirk, every glare, sharper and more visible. The father sat tall at the head of the table, his chair slightly elevated compared to the rest. It wasn't just furniture, it was a throne, and tonight he was the judge. His sister, dressed immaculately in a crisp blouse and gold earrings, sat to his right, her posture perfect, as though she had been preparing for this exact moment of admiration. The rest of the family filled the sides. An uncle with spectacles perched on his nose, sipping tea noisily. An aunt whispering gossip behind her hand. A few cousins scrolling half-heartedly on their phones, though their ears were fully tuned in. The clinking of cutlery had gone quiet. Every sound, every breath, seemed to pause after the father's cutting words. The son, quiet, unassuming, sat at the far corner, where shadows gathered more than light. His chair was slightly pulled back, as though even furniture refused to include him in the circle of respect. The silence stretched until the sister decided to break it. She leaned forward, her voice dipped in false modesty, but her smile gave her away. "Sister, Dad, please, you don't have to compare us. He'll understand someday. Responsibility isn't for everyone." The words hung in the air, polite on the surface but dripping with arrogance underneath. The cousins chuckled, covering their mouths as though she had said something clever. One of them muttered, She's not wrong, though. The father gave a proud nod, his chest swelling with satisfaction. Father, exactly. That's why I always say you're the one I can count on. You've proven yourself. Look at the way you handle your work, your life. Not a single complaint, not a single mistake. Each praise for the sister was a hidden arrow aimed at the son. He sat motionless, his fork untouched, his plate barely touched. But his stillness was not weakness. It was the silence before thunder. The aunt adjusted her dupatta and sighed dramatically. Aunt, some children make parents proud, others... Well, parents just keep waiting. The room hummed with approval. The sister lowered her eyes, pretending humility, but her smirk betrayed her. She adjusted her gold bracelet, letting it catch the light, as if to remind everyone of her success. Across the table, the son finally lifted his glass of water, his movements slow, deliberate. He sipped without looking at anyone, his calmness almost unnerving. His father noticed but mistook it for defeat. Father sternly, "See?" No response. No courage. This is the problem. Silence when there should be action. Always hiding. Always avoiding. The words were heavy, final, like a verdict being declared. Narrator's voice cut through, steady and thoughtful. The room wasn't just a dining table anymore. It had turned into a courtroom. A trial where the jury was his own blood and the judge was his father. And the verdict? Guilty of being less than his sister. The relatives shifted in their seats, some nodding, some whispering. Phones quietly recorded snippets of the conversation, disguised as casual scrolling. It was entertainment to them, drama unfolding live in front of their teacups. The son's eyes moved slowly, scanning the room. He saw his father's pride, his sister's smirk, his relatives' judgment. But instead of anger, there was a quietness in his gaze, as though he was watching a play where everyone else had forgotten their lines. The sister leaned closer to their father, her voice soft but perfectly timed for maximum effect. "Sister, don't worry, Dad. I'll always take care of things. You can trust me with everything. That's what family is for, right?" Her words were sugar-coated, but the glance she threw at her brother was pure venom. For a moment, the father softened, his hand reaching out to pat her shoulder. "Father, I know. You've never let me down. You're proof that my efforts weren't wasted." The son remained still. His fork clinked softly against the plate as he set it down, the small sound louder than any insult in that heavy silence. Narrator. What no one at that table knew was that behind every light shining on his sister's so-called success stood the very man they were mocking. The one they dismissed as careless. The one who had carried them all quietly, without recognition. But he did not speak. Not yet. The moment wasn't right. Instead, he looked at his father one last time, eyes calm, lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, before lowering his gaze again. The room thought he was defeated. But in truth, he was only waiting. The laughter around the table grew louder, but for the son, every chuckle was a hammer striking the same nail deeper into his heart. His father's voice echoed louder than the clinking of spoons, sharper than the clatter of plates. "Father, you've always been like this, unfocused, weak. You think life waits for people who hesitate? No, look at your sister, decisive, sharp, independent. She doesn't need to beg for help." The words were meant to sting, and they did. Yet the son didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded calmly, as if waiting for a storm to pass. His calmness infuriated his father even more. The uncle leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose. "Uncle, he doesn't even look ashamed. At least pretend, boy. Show some respect when your father speaks." The sister, feigning innocence, placed her hand gently over their father's arm. "Sister, please don't scold him too much. It's not his fault he doesn't understand responsibility. Some people, they're just not built for it," the relatives chuckled again. One cousin whispered under his breath, loud enough to be heard, "Built for failure, maybe." The son finally raised his eyes, glancing briefly at his cousin, then back to his plate. No reaction, no defense. Just silence. Narrator. In that silence, they mistook patience for weakness and composure for defeat. But every word spoken at the table was being recorded in his mind, every insult etched deeper into his resolve. The aunt leaned closer, her voice dripping with condescension. "Aunt, your poor father deserves better. one child lifting his name high, the other dragging it through the mud. Her words hung heavy in the air, and the father nodded grimly. Father, exactly. Sometimes I wonder if I failed as a parent with you. Maybe I gave you too much freedom. Too many chances. Look where that has led you. Nowhere. The son's hands tightened around his fork, but his face remained unreadable. The chandelier light above flickered slightly, as if even electricity was uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation. The sister smirked, her voice carrying the final blow. Sister, Dad, don't worry. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you never feel disappointed again. Her glance slid toward her brother, sharp and mocking, before turning back to her father with a sweet smile. That was the moment when the relatives erupted with approval. Uncle, now that's what family pride sounds like. Cousin, no wonder she's everyone's favorite. Phones were still out, screens glowing faintly under the table as some cousins pretended to type. But in reality, they were recording the scene, capturing humiliation like it was free entertainment. The son noticed. His eyes lingered on the phone screens for a second, but he didn't stop them. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, the faintest smile forming on his lips. Narrator. They thought they were documenting his downfall. What they didn't know was that they were writing the opening chapter of their own reckoning. The father's voice boomed again, filled with authority. Father, mark my words. One day you'll look back and regret wasting your life. But by then, it will be too late. Opportunities don't wait forever. The room nodded in unison, a chorus of agreement, as though his words were scripture. The son lowered his gaze, eyes fixed on the tablecloth pattern, his smile faint but unshakable. Suddenly, the aunt slammed her hand lightly on the table. Aunt, you should be grateful you even have a roof over your head. If it weren't for your father, where would you even be? The words struck harder than intended. For a moment, the son's silence wavered. His fingers tapped once against the table, slow, deliberate. No one noticed except his sister, who narrowed her eyes. Sister, leaning closer, whispering but audible, "Don't worry. Soon Dad won't have to depend on you at all. He has me, and you? You'll always just fade in the background." Her words weren't just cruel, they were a challenge. The relatives broke into laughter again. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls, suffocating in its weight. It was no longer just family talk. It was a public trial, and everyone had chosen their side. Narrator. The courtroom atmosphere tightened. The verdict seemed final. He was guilty of being less. But justice isn't always declared in words. Sometimes, it waits for the perfect silence before it strikes. The father leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He picked up his glass, sipping water with the ease of a man who believed the matter settled. His sister basked in the glow of victory, her smile wide, her laughter delicate and cruel. But in the far corner, the son's silence was shifting. It was no longer patience. It was no longer endurance. It was the calm of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to reveal. He glanced once more around the table. His eyes met his father's briefly, then his sister's, then the relatives who had laughed at his expense. For the first time that evening, his calm expression flickered into something sharper. Not anger. Not sadness. Resolve. He placed his fork down gently, the sound loud enough to draw attention. The laughter quieted, eyes turning toward him. The room held its breath. For the first time all night, the son spoke. His voice was low, steady, and carried an unsettling weight. "Son, are you done?" The words were simple, but the silence that followed was deafening. The father frowned, surprised. The sister's smile froze, brittle around the edges. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, sensing a storm that none of them had predicted. Narrator. They thought the trial was over. They thought the verdict was sealed. But sometimes the true story doesn't begin until the silence is broken. The son leaned forward, his eyes sharp now, no longer hiding in shadows. "Son, because if you are, then maybe it's time I finally speak." The chandelier light flickered again, and this time, the room didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a battlefield, and the war was just about to begin. The room fell into silence after his words. "Son, are you done?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. Yet it cut through the chatter like glass shattering on marble. The father leaned forward, his brows furrowed. He wasn't used to being questioned in his own house. "Father, excuse me?" The son placed his fork neatly on the plate, wiped his hands slowly with the napkin, and looked up. For the first time that night, his eyes weren't lowered. They were steady, calm, unnervingly calm. "Son, I've listened. Every word. Every comparison. Every insult. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I let you all finish." The relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged nervous glances. The sister tilted her head, her smirk returning. "Sister, and now what? You finally found the courage to talk back?" The son's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Son, not courage, patience." The words landed heavy. His tone wasn't defensive, wasn't angry. It was measured, like someone who knew more than he was letting on. The father scoffed, trying to regain control. "Father, patience? Don't try to sound wise. You're wasting your life while your sister builds hers." "That's the truth," the son nodded slowly. "Son, truth. Interesting word. But tell me, father, whose truth are we talking about? Yours, theirs, or the one nobody here actually knows?" The room stiffened. Eyes darted between him and his father. A few relatives leaned forward unconsciously, drawn in by the sudden shift. Narrator. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. A different kind of power, the kind that didn't need volume to silence a room. The aunt forced a laugh, trying to break the tension. "Aunt, oh, don't play riddles with us. We all know what we see. Your sister works hard, provides for your parents, carries the family name with pride. And you, well, you sit quietly, with nothing to show." The son turned his gaze toward her, not harsh, but sharp enough to make her pause. "Son, you're right. You see what's on the surface. But tell me, since when has the surface ever revealed the whole story?" The father slammed his hand lightly on the table, the sound making a few cousins jump. "Father, stop speaking in circles. Say what you mean. If you have something to prove, prove it. Otherwise, don't waste our time." The son leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. His calm smile hadn't faded. "Son, you've already decided who I am. Nothing I say will change that. But remember this moment, father. Remember every word spoken tonight, because soon, it won't be me who feels ashamed." The sister let out a short laugh, dismissive, trying to brush off the unease settling in the room. "Sister, there it is, the same old dramatic lines. You think you're mysterious, but really it just sounds like excuses." The son's eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "Son, no excuses. Just facts. And facts have a way of revealing themselves, whether anyone believes in them or not." The chandelier flickered again, as though punctuating his words. The relatives, who had once been laughing, now sat in uneasy silence, their smiles fading. Even the cousin who had mocked earlier put his phone down slowly, unsure if recording further was wise. Narrator. The power had shifted quietly, almost invisibly. They hadn't noticed it, but the one they called weak was no longer the one on trial. His silence had been his shield, and now his words were his weapon. The father leaned back, narrowing his eyes. "Father, big words? Empty words. Until you show us something real, they mean nothing." The son rose slowly from his chair. The scraping of the wooden legs against the floor echoed louder than any voice. He adjusted his collar, straightened his posture, and looked around the table. "Son, empty words, perhaps? Or perhaps they're the start of something you never expected to hear at this table." Every eye followed him. The sister's smirk faltered, replaced by unease. The relatives waited, their curiosity battling their fear of what might come next. He glanced once more at his father. "Son, you said she doesn't need help. That she's successful, responsible, unlike me. Maybe you're right. But tonight, father, you'll discover what responsibility truly looks like." The father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight in his son's voice was different now. Not arrogant, not pleading, but absolute. Narrator. This was no longer the boy they mocked. This was a man with a secret, a truth waiting to be revealed. And the silence before the storm had never felt heavier. The son stepped away from the table, his footsteps calm, deliberate. "Son, if you want proof, you'll have it. But when it comes, remember, it wasn't me who failed you. It was you who failed to see me." The room was frozen, the family caught between disbelief and dread. The son walked toward the door, leaving his words hanging in the air like thunder before lightning, and though he hadn't revealed the truth yet, everyone at that table felt it. The shift, the fear, the sense that everything they believed about him was about to collapse. The heavy silence still clung to the room after he walked away from the table. Every step of his echoed, slow and deliberate, like a countdown no one understood, but everyone felt. The father clenched his jaw, trying to mask the unease creeping up his spine. The sister crossed her arms, forcing a smirk back onto her face, though her fingers tapped nervously against her elbow. The relatives whispered faintly, their earlier laughter replaced with hushed questions. Finally, the father broke the silence. "Father, this is exactly what I meant. Walking away when things get serious. Escaping instead of facing reality." The son stopped at the doorway. Without turning, his voice carried across the room, calm, controlled, chilling. "Son, who said I'm escaping?" He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across every face at the table. Then, without hurry, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, and within seconds, the television on the wall lit up. A logo appeared. A company logo. One every single person in that room recognized, because it had been on billboards, news reports, and business magazines for months. The very company their relatives had praised, the one their community had spoken about with awe. Gasps spread around the table. The son's voice cut through their shock. "Son, you've seen this name before, haven't you? The one making headlines for record profits. The one expanding faster than any competitor. The one every investor wishes they had a stake in." He walked back toward the table step by step, his calm presence heavier than any shouting could have been. "Son, do you know who built it? Who started it from scratch?" The sister laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Sister, you expect us to believe you had anything to do with that?" He stopped right behind her chair, leaning slightly so his words brushed against her pride like a blade. "Son, believe? You don't have to, because the proof is right in front of you." With another tap on his phone, the television shifted to a live news report, an anchor speaking passionately about the company's founder. The screen showed a photo. His photo. The room froze. The father's glass slipped from his hand, water spilling across the tablecloth. The aunt's lips parted, but no sound came out. The cousin who had mocked earlier scrambled to lock his phone, ashamed to even hold it. The son straightened, his calm smile never fading. "Son, the man you all called careless. The one you mocked as a burden. The one you said would fade into the background. Is the very man running the company you celebrate?" The sister's smirk shattered. She pushed back her chair, standing abruptly. "Sister, no. No, this can't be true. Dad, say something." The father's face was pale, his lips trembling as he struggled to form words. For the first time, the man who always had the final say was silent. Narrator. This was the moment. The shift from arrogance to disbelief, from ridicule to regret. And the silence in the room was louder than any insult ever spoken. The son walked back to his seat, sitting down calmly as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His composure only deepened the weight of the revelation. "Son, you wanted proof, father. There it is. Not excuses. Not words, proof." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto his father's. "Son, all this time, you never asked what I was doing. You only assumed. You saw my silence as weakness, my patience as failure, and you praised her for responsibility while mocking me for invisibility." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Son, but invisibility is exactly what built this. While you doubted me, I was building something bigger than your expectations." The sister tried again, her voice trembling now. "Sister, you're lying. You're making this up." The son tapped his phone once more. The television switched to live footage, the company headquarters, employees pouring out of the building after hours. The news anchor announced that the company's CEO had just left an important board meeting. A car door opened, cameras flashed, and the man stepping out was him. Gasps rippled again. The father pushed back his chair slowly, standing with difficulty, his pride crumbling before his own son. "Father, all this time, it was you?" The son finally let his calm smile fade, replacing it with something sharper. "Son, yes, father, it was me. The son you called careless. The man you dismissed as a failure. The burden you said you carried. The silence that followed was unbearable. The sister looked down, unable to meet his eyes. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, shame burning across their faces. Every mocking word they had thrown at him now weighed against their conscience. Narrator. The courtroom had shifted. The jury was no longer laughing. The guilty was no longer the son. Judgment had turned, and the condemned were those who mocked him. The son leaned back in his chair, his voice calm, almost gentle. Son, so tell me, father, who is irresponsible now? The father's lips parted, but no answer came. And in that silence, the verdict was clear. The room was no longer the same. Moments ago, it had been filled with laughter, whispers, and arrogant smirks. Now, silence hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and sharp. Every relative who had chuckled at his expense now looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by the food they no longer had the appetite to eat. The sister's face had lost all color. Her smirk, once so confident, now trembled at the corners of her lips as though she were searching for a way to hold it together. Her hands fidgeted nervously, twisting the edge of her napkin. The father stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His eyes darted between his son and the glowing screen on the wall, where the news replayed his photo alongside headlines praising his leadership. For a man who had always believed he knew everything, this was a blow his pride wasn't ready to take. Finally, it was the aunt who spoke, her voice hesitant, almost apologetic. Aunt, we didn't know. No one could have imagined. Her words trailed off, her earlier arrogance dissolved into guilt. The uncle, who had been the loudest supporter of the sister just minutes ago, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses nervously. Uncle, yes? Yes, of course. You should have told us sooner. We would have been proud of you. The son looked at him calmly, his expression unreadable. Son, proud of me? Or proud of the success you could take credit for? The uncle's face turned red. He lowered his gaze, unable to respond. The cousins, who had laughed and whispered cruel jokes earlier, now shuffled in their seats, guilt painted across their faces. One of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked, betraying his unease. Cousin, brother, we didn't mean it. We were just joking. The son tilted his head slightly, his calm smile returning. Son, funny, I don't remember laughing. The sting of those words silenced them instantly. Narrator. The tables had turned. The same voices that once accused him were now trembling, scrambling for excuses. The same laughter that had mocked him was now buried under shame. The courtroom had spoken, and the jury was no longer against him. It was against those who ridiculed him. The sister finally found her voice, but it cracked under pressure. Sister, Dad, this can't be right. He's just pretending. Maybe he bought the footage. Maybe it's fake. But even as she spoke, the news anchor's words rang clearly from the television. CEO and founder, whose leadership has reshaped the industry. The camera zoomed in again on his face, live and undeniable. Her words collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. She sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, unable to look at anyone. The father's voice finally broke through, heavy and defeated. Father, all these years, I thought you were wasting your life. I thought you were the burden, while she was the pride. He turned to look at his son, and for the first time in his life, there was no authority in his gaze. Only regret. Father. I was wrong. The words stunned the room. The man who had never admitted fault, never lowered his pride, had spoken words no one expected to hear. The son leaned back in his chair, his calmness sharper than any anger could have been. Son, you weren't just wrong, Father. You were blind. And sometimes blindness hurts more than failure. The father lowered his head. The jury and the relatives, the cousins, the sister, and all followed suit. The same people who had stared at him with judgment now couldn't bear to meet his eyes. Narrator. In that moment, the verdict was clear. The so-called failure was the victor, and the ones who mocked him stood guilty in the court of truth. The son glanced at each of them in turn, his voice soft yet cutting like steel. Son, you compared me to her. You laughed at me. You called me careless, a burden. But remember this night. Remember who you judged and who you underestimated. The sister's eyes welled with tears, her pride collapsing piece by piece. The cousins shifted uncomfortably, wishing they could erase their laughter. The uncle and aunt bowed their heads, guilt heavy in their silence, and the father who once declared his son a failure, now stood defeated before the very son he had rejected. The son's final words sealed the judgment. Son, you were the jury. You passed your verdict without knowing the truth. Tonight, the truth passed its verdict on you. The room remained silent, each family member weighed down by the shame of their arrogance. The judgment was complete, not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence heavy enough to crush their pride. The silence in the room stretched on, heavier than any words could carry. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The laughter that once filled the dinner table had died, leaving behind only the sound of shame. The son sat calmly, his posture straight, his eyes steady. He was no longer the underestimated child, no longer the invisible one sitting in the corner of family gatherings. He was the man who had shattered illusions and forced the truth into the light. The father finally sank back into his chair, his hand pressed against his forehead. His voice was softer now, stripped of the sharpness it once carried. Father, all these years I thought I was guiding you. I thought I knew better, but it turns out I was blind. I judged you by appearances, by what I thought success should look like. And in doing so, I failed you. His words trembled with something unfamiliar. Regret. The son looked at him, his face unreadable, his voice calm but firm. Son, you didn't just fail me, father. You failed yourself. You failed by believing the world's definition of success. Grades, jobs, status. You couldn't see beyond the surface. And that blindness cost you your respect tonight. The father's eyes glistened. For the first time in decades, the man who never bowed his head lowered it in defeat. The sister, who had sat stiff and silent, finally broke. Tears slipped down her cheeks as her voice cracked. Sister, I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to be seen as the best. I wanted their praise. And when they compared us, I thought it made me stronger. The son turned toward her, his gaze piercing but not cruel. Son, at the cost of belittling me. At the cost of treating your own blood like he was nothing. That isn't strength, sister. That's insecurity dressed as arrogance. Her sobs filled the room. The cousins, uncles, and aunts remained silent, their shame reflected in their lowered eyes. No one dared to defend her. Narrator. And so the house that once echoed with comparisons and judgments had fallen quiet under the weight of truth. Every whisper, every insult, every cruel laugh, all of it had turned against them. They were no longer the jury. They were the guilty. The son pushed his chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor breaking the silence. He stood tall, his presence commanding the room without effort. Son, remember this night. Remember how quick you were to laugh, to compare, to declare judgment without knowing the truth. Next time you think of calling someone a failure, ask yourself, do you really know their story? Or are you just blinded by your own pride? His words were not just for them. They were for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever been mocked, underestimated, or judged unfairly. The father raised his head slowly, his eyes red with unspoken guilt. Father, can you forgive me? The son's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. Son, forgiveness isn't mine to give, father. It's yours to earn. And it starts by never making the same mistake again. The father nodded silently, accepting the weight of his own flaws. The son picked up his coat from the back of his chair, his movements unhurried. As he walked toward the door, every eye in the room followed him. Not with disdain, not with laughter, but with respect. Before stepping out, he paused, his voice firm, echoing through the heavy air. Son, success isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need validation. True success is silent, until the day it speaks for itself. Tonight it spoke, and you all heard it. He opened the door, and the cool night breeze swept in. He stepped out, leaving behind a family broken by truth but forever changed by it. Narrator. And so, the son who was once mocked walked out not as a victim, but as a victor. The laughter that once haunted him would never touch him again. For he had shown the world, and his family, that appearances deceive, but truth never lies. As the door closed, the camera lingered on the father's face, etched with regret. On the sister's tears, born of shattered pride. On the silent relatives, their arrogance stripped away. And then, the final shot returned to the son, walking into the night. His silhouette strong, his steps steady, a man who no longer needed their approval, for he had already earned the respect of the only one who mattered, himself. Final punch, direct to audience. So next time someone calls you a failure, smile. Let them laugh. Let them judge. Because the day truth speaks, their laughter will choke in their throats. Remember, never measure your worth by their opinion. Your story is still being written.